Welcome back to our part two of our series about the clear and present danger of Alabama bass to black bass fisheries in the United States. Last video, we talked about the effect of Alabama bass on largemouth bass fisheries, focusing more on reservoirs. And today we're going to talk more about what's going on with the other species of bass when Alabama bass get introduced into where they are, including smallmouth bass and spotted bass. So just to recap briefly, what are Alabama bass? They're endemic to the Mobile Basin. They were formerly known as Alabama spotted bass before being elevated to species status in 2007. They are highly adaptable. They live almost anywhere. They can be in anything from small streams to large reservoirs. They grow very quickly. They're aggressive. They're particularly successful in deeper, clearer, rocky reservoirs that don't have a lot of shoreline cover. So why in the world does everyone throw Alabama bass in these places? Well, simply because they're big, they're plentiful, they're fun to catch. In some cases, they're easier to catch than the native largemouth bass or the smallmouth bass. And although they don't get as big as largemouth bass or certainly smallmouth bass, they can, in certain instances, get really big, such as like this current world record of Alabama bass caught in the California reservoir that had a steady diet of trout. Okay, so we go back to this slide here. We've already talked about the first fork of the road with largemouth bass. Now we're going to talk about the second fork of the road, and that is hybridization with smallmouth and spotted bass and other species. In Fontana Reservoir in North Carolina, which used to be a smallmouth bass dominated system, biologists went out, collected 50 smallmouth bass, at least what they thought were smallmouth bass, and ran genetics on them and found out that almost 80% of them were hybrids with Alabama bass. Lake Gaston is up in the north part of North Carolina near the Virginia border. In this case, it was spotted bass. Spotted bass are in that lake. The punctulatus, Micropterus punctulatus, the ones that only get about 2 pounds and are found mostly in the Ohio and Mississippi River Basin. These fish here would be introduced, but they were there for a long time. When Alabama bass got in there, they collected a sample of a bunch of fish that looked like spotted bass, ran the genetics on them, and they found that none of the fish that they thought were spotted bass were actually spotted bass. Instead, they were Alabama bass or various hybrids between Alabama bass and spotted bass. So any lake that already has spotted bass in it, like for instance, almost every lake in Tennessee, if you put Alabama bass in there, they're very hard to distinguish, especially if you don't know to be looking for Alabama bass. So that's a place where they can sneak in and start doing bad things before you even notice that they're there. One of the ones that's of extreme concern in Virginia is Claytor Lake. For those of you who might not know much about Claytor Lake, it's one of the largest impoundments on the New River, which is a world-class smallmouth bass river in southwestern Virginia. It flows up into West Virginia where it joins with the Ohio. And this is not a place you want Alabama bass to be. And so Virginia biologists have been sampling the lake, and you can see that, a lot of the fish that they thought were spotted bass were actually some kind of a hybrid with Alabama bass, and they're already starting to see Alabama bass, smallmouth bass hybrids there. And they're still tracking this. The fish are now found below the dam, and so the future of the smallmouth bass fishery here is certainly in jeopardy and appears pretty bleak. Philpott Lake in Virginia, this is an Atlantic coast drainage reservoir. Again, Alabama bass got put in there. And what they see is that about 40% of the fish that they found were hybrids of Alabama bass and something else, a lot of them being smallmouth bass. Philpott was at least a really good smallmouth bass fishery, and it looks like that's on its way out the door. And if you want to see just a visual of what something like this looks like, this is just a bunch of genetic compositions, right? A picture's 1,000 words. Here's a picture of just some random fish that they collect, and these are fish that they did take genetics from. And you can see up here you have something that looks pretty much like an Alabama bass. You have some fish down here that look like, they're clearly hybrids between smallmouth bass and Alabama bass. And this is a weird fish. This is a largemouth bass, Alabama bass hybrid, which is pretty rare. But the bottom line is that the fish come in and start hybridizing with everything and kicking the largemouth bass to the curb. Moving down to South Carolina, this is one where biologists went out and collected smallmouth bass broodstock. So this is a bunch of biologists saying, yeah, these are smallmouth bass. And then they ran the genetics and found out that only 60% of them actually were. The rest of them were some kind of hybrids of Alabama bass, Bartram's bass, the native red-eye there, or some other hybrid. So one of the consequences of having fish like this in the reservoir is all of a sudden collection of broodstock for hatcheries, which happens every year, all of a sudden has an extra step and takes more work because now you have to screen all the fish. And often, like in this case, you had to throw, 40% of them out and you have to go get more. So it makes everything more difficult, makes things more expensive, and hinders your efficiency. But the consequences of Alabama bass introduction extend far beyond reservoirs. They don't stay in the reservoirs. That is where they often get put, but then they don't stay there. They move up out of the reservoirs into the tributaries and the river above the reservoir. They also move below the dam. And so they spread through the system. And then they start hybridizing with all kinds of other bass. So in Georgia and now South Carolina, the native Bartram's bass, which is only found in the Savannah River Basin, probably primary threat to that is hybridization with Alabama bass in the reservoirs, and which they basically eliminated them out of the reservoirs, and now they're all in the streams. Another red-eye bass species, the Chattahoochee bass, they're not found in reservoirs, but they're Alabama bass that found their way out of the reservoirs are going up in tributary streams and hybridizing these fish out of existence. And that includes up above Lake Lanier. The Altamaha bass, undescribed red-eye bass species, again, one of its main problems is hybridization with introduced Alabama bass. Shoal bass in the Flint and Chattahoochee River, more in the Chattahoochee River, lots of hybridization with Alabama bass there. And then, of course, we already talked about smallmouth and spotted bass, but you know what? They're found in streams too. And so, again, the Alabama bass do not just stay in the reservoir. They move up in the streams and they cause real problems. And what we're starting to see is smallmouth bass fisheries in particular, with, let's face it, they're more of a popular fish than a spotted bass that only gets 15 inches or so. But what we're seeing here is a slow and steady erosion of smallmouth bass fisheries in streams and rivers, and there really is no fix here. And it has a lot of fish biologists, and some of the anglers that know about this anyway, really concerned about the future. So largemouth bass, we already mentioned, they're impacted through the competition and replace them. They impact these other native bass more through hybridization than competition, however. And these endemic bass species seem to be especially vulnerable to this. I mean, smallmouth bass are found over half the country. It's going to be tough to eliminate them. Theoretically, you're not going to put Alabama bass in every place they could be. But if you think about Bartram's bass found in one river basin, and only the upper half of that above the fall line, obviously it doesn't take much for them to become edging towards extinction. It definitely threatens river and stream smallmouth bass and spotted bass as well. And we're seeing this. Western North Carolina, there's streams that are starting to turn into Alabama bass or hybrid stuff. The New River there's some scary stuff going on there right now. The other thing, I mentioned it already, these impacts occur extremely rapidly. We have the data from the reservoirs, and it matches kind of what we think we're seeing with the streams. By the time you start seeing these fish, it's already too late. And again, I'll just go through how quickly everything has been spreading. Just going to click through this and just look how fast that is. So the question is, where does this end? So that's roughly where the non-native range of Alabama bass is at the current moment. The question is when does it start moving outward? And they're already starting to be found here and there in Middle Tennessee. Kentucky has been looking for spotted or Alabama bass genetics in their fisheries. Virginia is trying to keep them going any farther north. We don't know anything about Alabama bass really, as far as like their thermal requirements and where can and can't they live. I was on a podcast a few years back, and we were talking about this issue, and someone asked me, well, what about the Susquehanna? Obviously a world-class smallmouth bass fishery. And my only response was, well, look how close the upper edge of their invasion is to the Susquehanna, and look how far they've moved. The Susquehanna is well within the range of somebody moving Alabama bass up there. If they get in the Susquehanna, what about Lake Erie? Wouldn't that be fun? What about Lake Champlain? Where does it end? We don't know. We don't understand the thermal limits of an Alabama bass. What we also don't understand is the limits of people wanting to move them. And it only takes one or two people to move fish to change the history and the fate of a fishery forever. So this is a real problem. It extends throughout the Southeast, and we hope not much farther. And the only way we're ever going to fix this is to stop moving fish. It isn't cool to move fish. Lake Lanier, to this day, still has not been recreated anywhere. There is still no fishery out there like Lake Lanier. Even though Alabama bass have been moved in all kinds of reservoirs in 5 or 6 different states that we know of, there is still no other Lake Lanier. So the thought of you're going to recreate Lake Lanier by moving your Alabama bass to your favorite reservoir nearby that you can't catch fish in, it's not going to happen. Stop doing it. I don't think a lot of people realize the impacts that happen when you put it in there and the consequences. They don't just stay there. And we don't know what happens when they start moving. You can't predict what happens when they start moving or how quickly they move. So the bottom line is don't move fish, and definitely do not move Alabama bass. It is not cool. They are not a good thing. I hope this opened some eyes out there, and I'd enjoy to hear any comments and discussion about this. Thank you so much, and have a good day.